Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Urban Odyssey. Today is a show I have been really excited to do, and I think a lot of the viewers have too. If I remember correctly, we did our last show beginning of January. Uh, Michelle Gibson today is my honorable guest, so let me go ahead and bring Michelle up and let her introduce herself. Michelle, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Urban, and thanks for having me back. I've been
Thanks for
looking
being here.
forward to being back on your show. You provide a lot of great information and are really good at piecing things together. So this is a really wonderful opportunity for me.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Seemingly, the last show we did got really, really, really positive feedback. A lot of people liked it. A lot of people were really interested in it, and I appreciate you coming back again. I know it was a little bit of time in between, but the time kind of goes by fast. And I know that you took some time to prepare some stuff for today, and I also appreciate that.
Yes, I did. I put together a PowerPoint on the subject of the company. And so I've organized a lot of material. There's a tiny bit of overlap with the last presentation, but it's basically more focused on evidence for the presence of the company and the company model for how we came into the world that we're in today.
The company, yeah, the company's interesting. It's a term that has been around for a while, but today, if you go into the right circles, you would say the company, and it would go to people that you're talking about, the CIA, Central Intelligence. They go by the company, but that's not where that term came from.
Right, I'll be bringing the CIA into it a little bit, but it's not where it originated. And I have to answer Gary's question. Yes, I did get snow.
Oh, did you? Okay, let's see here if I can take
We
this
got
off.
about an inch last night here in
Really?
Prescott.
Yeah, it's been uh, crazy lately. We got a lot of snow too. Okay, cool.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
we've kind of lucked out on the weather end of things. It was actually pretty mild up until this past week, and we've gotten snow a couple times this week, and I think it'll warm up again next week. But yeah, we've kind of been sitting here in a little pocket where we didn't get the crazy cold temperatures of a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, here in I'm from Ohio, and we got this year was the most snow that I've ever seen in my whole life. Probably set a new record. I haven't seen anything like that. It was pretty crazy.
Yeah, I'm getting ready to head into Ohio in my part 7 of my Great Lakes series
There
on
you
the
go.
on Lake Erie. So
Awesome.
I'm in the Buffalo area right now, and then I'm going to be heading west.
I
So
think there's a
it'll be
lot of
crazy too.
skeletons in the closet.
I can definitely confirm that.
Awesome. Well, okay. Well, why don't you go ahead and set the stage for the company, and I will, whenever there's something of note, I will kind of find a way in, and then I will let you kind of go at it. This is the stage is all yours.
Okay. Yeah, just let me know if you want me to stop presenting,
Sure, you're fine.
and I will go through what I've gotten prepared today. So the dates things are happening is very important when looking at where things in the New World really got kicked off and the origins of our modern world, starting with the East India Company. So that's where the company first came from.
East India Company.
The East India Company was nicknamed the Company. The British East India Company was established as a joint stock company by the Royal Charter on December 31st of 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I. It was called the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading in the East Indies, and by the mid-1700s accounted for half of the world's trade in such commodities as cotton, silk, indigo, spices, sugar, tea, and opium. For comparison, the flag of the British East India Company is pictured on the top left, and of course, the flag of the United States on the bottom right, with clear commonalities. And I just want to reiterate here, I want to make it clear, I'm sharing what the narrative tells us, and I have some real questions about what's real in the narrative and what's fabricated. And that I think the history of the Earth is completely different from what we've been told. And I think there was a time manipulation and something happened and came in and overlaid a new history on top of the existing infrastructure of the Earth. And I think at some point the history is fabricated, and at some point the controllers have written themselves into the narrative. And I was telling Urban before we started, I think that was sometime in the 1700s.
Um,
But there is information here that's important to bring forward, and people can be the judge of what they think.
I,
Go ahead, Urban.
yeah, I was just going to say, I think really it would be a bit foolish to believe that's not happened before, because we know the Roman Catholic Church has done it. And it just reminded me, there was a scholarly text about how the Jesuit historical canon works. So this has happened before, and it is something that we pretty much have to take into consideration. I mean, which like what is real, what is fake, that's kind of up to, you know, the evidence, what you kind of think, but it's definitely happened, no question about that.
Right, and the Jesuits have their fingerprints all over this new timeline. So do the Freemasons. But the Jesuits were all over the Great Lakes.
Absolutely.
In particular, I've been studying that subject here for the last 6 months at least. And so they pop up prominently at the beginning of our new historical narrative, and specifically the founding of the New World.
Mm-hmm.
They're right there in it.
Absolutely. All of the Americas.
Absolutely. So, I'm just saying that because I'm sharing what's in the narrative, but there's still important information in there to flesh out, to understand how we got here in
Absolutely.
our world today. So I'm going to go back to my screen share and move along to the company that we know of. It's important to note that the American Central Intelligence Agency has the same nickname. And it's not my area of expertise, but there's a lot of shady activities that the CIA has been involved in. That anybody that's been following alternative information for quite a while, and I know I have been for, let's say, 15 years, maybe more, that not everything is on the up and up with the CIA. So there's a lot of really shady activities associated with them. And if you're watching this stream, you probably know that already. The East India Company, for one example, was the means by which the British took over control of India and its fabulous wealth and culture. India was called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire and its largest and most important overseas possession. On March 20th of 1602, the Dutch East India Company was chartered to trade with India and Southeast Asian countries by the States General of the Netherlands, the supreme legislature of the Netherlands, and it was granted a 21-year monopoly for the Dutch spice trade. It was a mega corporation, which is defined as a massive conglomerate, usually private, holding near monopolistic, if not monopolistic, control over multiple markets. It was chartered to trade with Mughal India and primarily Mughal Bengal, from where 50% of textiles and 80% of silks were imported. And I'm going to stop sharing here for just a moment because the trade companies were a major way as to how this takeover occurred. And in places like Mughal Bengal, which is today's Bangladesh, and even India, but Bangladesh is an even more striking example of how these fabulously wealthy countries were reduced to abject poverty.
I was going to say that I'm glad that you brought that up. One example that I had seen recently, very kind of lesser known, it's on the down low, but what went down in Paraguay and Argentina area during the 17th and 18th centuries, the mainly Jesuit priests came and they set up what was called the reducciones of the native people. So basically, they went there to help them on spiritual matters. They moved in and they set up these work camps that were totally okay, is what they want everybody to believe. And so they would sell their goods for them, and they would kind of, if you want to do business with the rest of the world, we're going to have to help you do it. We're going to take a cut. It was kind of a soft plantation. And so, exactly what you said, this was something that they were doing not just with the church missions, but with the East India Company. And there was the Dutch and then the British East India Company. So, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Again, in terms of how we got to the world today, so like if you look at the example of like the big picture of India, which would have included modern day Pakistan and modern day Bangladesh. So the East India Company gets in there, basically takes over the whole subcontinent. And then at some point, and I think it was 1871, somewhere in that time period, maybe between 1860 and 1871, transferred control areas that they controlled over to the British Crown. And then at that same period of time, they were systematically replacing the ruling families, the original ruling families, with their own people.
Yep.
And then calling them criminals. And so you get into the caste system there, and the ruling family around Udaipur became untouchables and barely receiving what's necessary for living, for a decent life. If even that, I mean, just a really bad existence.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just flipped it on its head entirely. So these are ways that they came in and took over. And then another thing was the partition of India that took place after the end of World War II. And the whole thing with Gandhi, well, it's really misleading because you have this whole independence thing going on and breaking free from the British. Independence comes, and then you have the partition, and you have people and families separating, a lot of violence. And the violence that we see today is related to that, as well as a lot of the social problems around the world with people coming from that part of the world. I mean, say specifically Pakistan, but it's a whole lot. It's not the only example. Their cultures were destroyed. They were left rootless within this very cruel system, and then creating havoc in other places around the world by this new system that was set up by this whole overarching plan that was designed to destroy the fabric of society and create chaos.
Well, yeah, what most people don't know is that, like, before World War One, most of Europe was still under monarchy and kings and queens. But then after World War One, it was, and then World War Two, it was just like a hegemony of two or three nations.
Yeah, and that was all systematically replaced, and that happened. I would say probably starting in the early 1700s to, like you say, World War One. And even World War II in a couple of examples. But those families got replaced by a very, for the most part, by the obscure ducal lineage of the Duke Francis of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. And he incarnated in 1750. And he was the progenitor of the line of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which was the royal house of Britain until 1917 when it changed to Windsor. But that wasn't the only family. I mean, it was like throughout Europe, like Queen Victoria's children married into the other royal houses of Europe, and some of Duke Francis's other progeny did as well. So they took it over. And I think they were part of the hijack.
That would make sense because during World War II, what a lot of people really is it's been kind of hidden, but there's this idea that a lot of the royals, and as you said, they're of this German Austrian heritage, and they're all, for the most part, related in various degrees of separation. But this idea being that all of those royals um, gave funding to Nazi Germany to act as this very specific word, a bulwark against communism, basically saying we are afraid of the Bolsheviks, what was going on in Russia, and we need somebody to protect us. So I wonder, just my thoughts, if they were had done all of this and people were rightfully very mad at them, and so they needed to be protected or isolated from that.
Well, that's why they changed the name.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened during World War One. So it was supposedly because of anti-German sentiment during World War One.
Mm-hmm.
But the families were totally connected.
Yeah.
The families in Germany and the families in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of stuff that happened during World War II that basically, like for example, with the Channel Islands, they were occupied almost the entirety of the Second World War by Nazi Germany. And essentially, when they invaded, it was like they were allowed to invade,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. And I've done quite a bit of research on that quite a few years ago. But there were several places, the Channel Islands, France, Norway, Denmark, that were occupied almost the entirety of World War II. So it's like there was something there that they really wanted.
Yeah.
And they were, in the case of the Channel Islands, they were allowed into do whatever they wanted. And there's just a lot of really things that don't make any sense when you look back on it.
Yeah.
You know, and I know I'm going to be 63 this year, so none of this was even a thought in my head when I was growing up and learning history and these other things. But when you look back with different eyes,
Mm-hmm.
a really different story emerges as far as what's been going on here. And I have a feeling that world events right now are going to become very illuminating in terms of some of the things that we might be talking about have been going on,
For sure.
like things that are happening right now. So it's taking too long from my perspective since I've been awake for a while, but things finally seem to be moving on that score. And Prince Andrew was arrested yesterday, so that's just one example.
Yeah, there was. Did you remember when they had that white horse covered in blood running through? 666 days was the difference between his arrest and that horse. 666 days. He had turned 66.
66.
This just happens so much lately. What is going on with all these numbers? What are they doing?
Yep. That was all over my social media either today or yesterday. His arrest was yesterday, and that information you just shared was on there today.
That's wild.
So I'm going to go back to my presentation, but I did want to make that point. It's
That's great.
They go into these countries and then they just reduce them to figurative rubble, literal and figurative rubble. So the Dutch East India Company was a mega corporation, which is defined as a massive conglomerate, usually private. Okay, I think I already said that. That's the only thing about. Oh, I know what it was. Hang on. Okay. The Dutch East India Company was the first formally listed public company by widely issuing shares of stock and bonds to the general public in the early 1600s, and was the world's most valuable company of all time, with a worth of $7.9 trillion, and considered the forerunner of modern corporations by many. Then in 1606, 6 years after the formation of the British East India Company and 4 years after the formation of the Dutch East India Company, King James VI and I issued royal charters for what became known as the Virginia Company and the Virginia Company of Plymouth, with the objective of raising funds from investors in order to colonize the eastern coast of America. And I don't think it's coincidence that the heraldry looks almost identical in design.
Yeah, that's Savoy as well. That red and white, the red cross, it's also connected to Savoy, which pops up in. That is the Jesuits' founder. They don't ever mention the guy who was Loyola's best friend, who was a Frenchman, a Savoyard. They call him Savoyard. They don't ever mention this guy. So very interesting. A lot of money, banking, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it keeps showing up. The Mercers maiden shows up on the coat of arms of the Virginia companies. So this lady here. The maiden on the Virginia company's coat of arms is the emblem of the Mercers and was said to have first appeared on a seal in 1425. And it is also said that her origins and the reason why she was chosen as the emblem are unknown. But Mercers were cloth merchants and involved in the importation of fine cloth like silk and linen and other textiles and cloth and piece goods. So I'm going to go into the importance of cloth in our history. It's important to note that the use of armorial bearings went from individuals to corporate bodies starting in 1438 in our historical narrative, with a royal charter of incorporation for the Worshipful Company of Drapers, which were retailers or wholesalers of cloth used mainly for clothing. In our historical narrative since the 1300s, royal charters have been used to grant a right or power to an individual or body corporate, the formal term for a corporation. A body corporate functions as a legal person in law that can do things a human person is usually able to do but are not literal people. A royal charter is a formal grant issued by a monarch under royal prerogative as letters patent. A king may impose new laws by royal prerogative, a body of customary authority, privilege, and immunity recognized in common and civil law jurisdictions within a monarchy as belonging to the sovereign that becomes widely vested in government. Letters patent are a type of legal instrument in the form of a published written order issued by a monarch or other head of state granting an office, right, monopoly, title, or status to a person or corporation. A chartered company is an association with investors and shareholders that is incorporated or formed into a new corporation and granted rights for the purposes of trade, exploration, or colonization. Until the 19th century, royal charters were the only means that a company could become incorporated other than by an act of parliament. So that's how they did it. That is how they started the process of colonization and taking over everything. And companies becoming people.
I was going to say a company is absolutely a mystical body. That it's important to understand from the older sense. I am limited to what I could do in one lifetime. I'm eventually going to pass away because everybody does. But if I incorporate or form a body and bring people in, you have a department that is responsible for, let's say accounting. It's like an organ in a body. It transcends one human life. They can accomplish some goal over history because if once the current people pass away, they can bring new people in and pass the torch down to the next generation. So it is a very mystical concept, and it allows that to happen.
Right. And so they brought in their new construct and paradigm because they had all this land on the earth that they were gunning for take over. And they messed, they gave us a fake history, they gave us a false legal system because they can't lay a finger on us because we're sovereign beings. And I'll get more into that later in the presentation. And that's an area that more people are probably familiar with from more recent times with your straw man and things like that. So they turned companies into people, and they turned people into companies. And that's all part of the fraud that's been perpetrated on all of us.
On the topic of cloth, the idea just popped up in my head. There traditionally was it was a very mystical idea when cloth became entered into the lexicon, but the goddess called Circe, Circe, was kind of the weaver. They said weaver of fate, the fate weaver, and Circe is the root word for kirk and church, which is very interesting. So I wonder if that has any connection there.
It probably does. That wouldn't surprise me. Okay, so let me go back. The Council for New England was also said to have been established by a royal charter from King James as an English joint stock company in order to found colonial settlements between 1620 and 1635. So that's the flag for the Council of New England, or Red Cross. And then this is the area that the Council of New England charter provided for the establishment of colonies. So it's between 34 degrees north and 44 degrees north, becoming the Plymouth colony up here. So you've got, I think I've got, yeah, there we go. So they lined it out where they were supposed to go back in the early 1600s. And this charter that I was talking about, this area became the Plymouth colony, the Massachusetts Bay colony, the province of New Hampshire, the New Haven colony, and the province of Maine. And they were to be managed by landed gentry. The first permanent colony in New England was the Plymouth Plantation, which at its height occupied most of the southeastern portion of Massachusetts, where Cape Cod is located. We are told that the Puritan congregation, also known as the Pilgrims, who settled the Plymouth colony, had obtained a land patent from the Virginia Company of Plymouth in June of 1619, and they sought to finance their venture through a group of businessmen known as the Merchant Adventurers, who viewed the new colony as a way to make a profit. Officially known as the Company of Merchant Adventurers of London, it had been founded in the city of London in the early 15th century, and its main export was cloth, especially undyed broadcloth, in exchange for a large range of foreign goods. In the history of colonialism, plantation was a form of colonization where settlers would establish a permanent or semi-permanent settlement in a new region, like the colonizers were literally planting themselves in a new place. Not only were settlements and settlers being planted in a new region from somewhere else, this plantation system of the colonizers quickly laid the foundation for slavery on large farms owned by planters, where cash crop goods were produced, like cotton, which was used in the production of cloth. Any thoughts on that, Josh?
Yeah, cloth was a very, as you said, it is kind of the cornerstone of. I guess you could say now that I said cornerstones, stonemasons. All of these guilds were very rich, and so they today, you might think of all of the companies in Silicon Valley or something like that. But if you go back to this time period, the same kind of equivalent would have been the spice, the cloth, traders, the guilds, merchants, and that basically is the city of London. They have guilds still, and those guilds kind of morphed into banks because they got so rich. Once you have so much money you don't know what to do with, you can just go and enter banking. You don't have to do anything but loan the money now. You do usury.
Yep. Hold that thought. I'll be tying that back in.
Okay.
Around the same, let me go back to this one. The Royal Society of London, which we are told was established by a royal charter issued by King Charles II in 1660. So this is the coat of arms for that. The meaning of the Royal Society's motto, Nullius in verba, means take nobody's word for it. While on one hand, take nobody's word for it could certainly mean testing through scientific experimentation. On the other hand, another meaning would be not to blindly accept what we are told and to encourage people to do their own research and think for themselves. So it's kind of um, open-ended in its meaning. And I think at some point we've all been taught to, the whole idea of the rigor of the scientific process and do your testing. But I think it's really important now for people not to blindly accept what they've been told. And as part of waking up to the reality of the world that we live in, encouraging people to do their own research and think for themselves. The Great Plague of London took place between 1665 and 1666. We are told that this was the last major epidemic of bubonic plague to take place in England, and that it killed 100,000 people in 18 months. In the poorer parts of London, people lived in filth and squalor at this time, living in overcrowded tenements with no sanitation and open drains. So that's what we've always been told. Around the same time the Great Plague was happening in our historical narrative, in September of 1666, the Great Fire of London swept through central parts of London and gutted the medieval city of London. The homes of 70,000 inhabitants out of the 80,000 inhabitants that lived there were destroyed. Quite interestingly, it did not reach the aristocratic district of Westminster and Whitehall. We are told that Sir Isaac Newton had been developing his theory of gravity as far back as 1665, and that in 1666, Newton famously observed the falling apple, upon which he developed his foundational law that gravity is universal and must also apply to the orbit of the moon around the sun and then to all objects on the earth. So I'm going to bring some other important 1666 events in, but I just wanted to point that out, that the whole concept of Earth, the heliocentric universe, and Earth revolving as a planet around the sun with the other planets, that took place in this same period of time. So in the early 1540s, so the Jesuits were founded in like around 1540, 1541, and the Copernican theory of the heliocentric universe was accepted in 1543 and replaced Ptolemy's Earth-centered universe. And so there you have the flip between a universe that's Earth-centered and the whole globe thing. Mm-hmm. We know how much talk and beliefs there are around flat Earth versus the globe. But what I wanted to point out is that our whole science, this whole science of Newton's, is based around a spinning Earth. And then that gets into, not only have we been lied to about our history, but we've also been lied to about a lot of other things, mm-hmm. including our science. And I did not start out with an opinion about whether the Earth was flat or round, but I found a lot of evidence in the years that I've been looking at ley lines and tracking ley lines that our maps have been tampered with. Mm-hmm. And the ley lines were removed, and just a lot of sleight of hand with projections and the shape of the Earth and that kind of thing. So I do feel like things are definitely not what we've been told by the establishment.
Yeah, I think definitely there's a lot of stuff that's just so suspicious about it. And then what I learned was that kind of what was the difference between the astrology that somebody like Nostradamus was using, or somebody would have been using during that time period, and the whole idea is that the old idea of astrology was based on the old flat Earth or non-globe model. And so now, people with the modern astrology, is a difference. And so I was trying to figure out like what is the difference, and it really all comes back to, I guess, I don't remember if this is a specific way it was worded, but the idea that the sun is the center of the universe versus, the observer is the center of the universe, the person looking around and seeing things, which would have been like the old medieval model. And so it's very interesting, very interesting.
That was my understanding of the definition of the theory of relativity
Yes,
by Einstein, that it's based on the observer.
absolutely.
And so in the presentation so far, I've talked about the Great Plague of 1666, the Great Fire of 1666, Newton's apple in 1666, and there's a few other important things to bring forward about 1666. Like the Cestui Act. We have this Act of Parliament declared all men and women as dead and lost at sea after the Great Plague and the Great Fire. And so that has significant ramifications for what's been going on in the world. And basically, according to this, everything was put into a trust, and you have to prove that you're alive. But all these people were dead from these events, and we're going to take over. And so I'm going to read from the screen here. The Cestui Act provides for how estates shall be passed on to heirs and beneficiaries in order to settle the estate if a man is lost at sea or presumed dead. When we are lost at sea and presumed dead, we have abandoned our estate, the landed estate, the body, and we're licensed to float on the sea of commerce in what is effectively a ghost ship. And since we are then effectively enemies of the state, the attorneys are authorized to board our vessels and effect legal piracy operating under bar cards as letters of marque and reprisal. That's where we've been. Lost at sea, legally. Sabbatai Zevi was proclaimed Messiah by Nathan of Gaza in 1666. He was a Jewish mystic and Kabbalist. Sabbatai Zevi, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Sabbatai Zevi and his follower Jacob Frank brought Sabbatean Frankism to the world. And so in looking for information on that, you find it's connected to communism, sexual depravity, corporate leftism, multiculturalism, deconstructivism and critical theory, radical jurisprudence, and large-scale non-selective immigration. They are all linked to Sabbatean Frankism, a distinct quasi-satanic schism within Jewry, and it was prevalent. That influence was prevalent among top Jewish intellectuals from 1850 to 1950. We were talking about the inversion before we got started that we're living in right now. And so, you can look, when people talk about the short season of Satan, I mean, I can definitely say from my research that there appears to be a lot pointing towards this time period, the 1666 and the 1660s in general.
This was the same time period that the book it's called the Jesuit Historiographical Canon, it was this exact time period, about 1500s to the late 1600s, this idea of the rewriting of history, but it's in a very crafty, subtle sense. They do it by rewriting the textbooks and doing it through education. How are certain things taught? And so I'm glad that you actually brought up the Sabbatean contributions. I like that. That was good because every single one of them, I think almost all of them came from some type of like college or university or something like that. A lot of this stuff comes out of the universities. A lot of it.
Yeah, and I didn't go into all the 1666 dates. I have 1667. I wanted to bring forward these, and then another one is Paradise Lost by John Milton. But there's more, and that connects back to what you're saying. So this was published in 1667, and in Paradise Lost, newly banished fallen angels organized, and Satan volunteered to corrupt the newly created earth and God's new and most favored creation, mankind. Satan goes to the Garden of Eden and convinces Eve by duplicity to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which directly led to their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And personally, I believe this was original disclosure about what's taken place here. Paradise was lost, and we were brought to the corrupted, inverted world we live in today. It is interesting to note that the spelling of the verb to die in the poem Paradise Lost, referring to death, is spelled dye, the verb for a substance used to color something, including but not limited to cloth. After their fall, the Son of God tells Adam and Eve about God's judgment. Before their fall, the Father foretells their treason. This is what it said in my reference, and that man with his whole posterity must die. Die he or justice must, unless for him some other able and as willing pay the rigid satisfaction, death for death. And it's interesting to note that dyes for coloring cloth went from being obtained from natural sources to being primarily synthetically sourced starting in the mid-1800s. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about, that we know about, that in the community of people that are more awake than other people, for whatever reason, been talking about the poisoning of the air, our clothing, big pharma. It's no secret for those that are awake or aware that these things have been going on for a long time. It's not been a secret. It's just been hidden from people because they're not aware of it, and because it's been covered up by the mainstream media and things like that.
It was interesting that you pointed out the spelling of die, and this somebody, a friend of mine, had brought up this issue of the Great Vowel Shift, and I'm certain you know what this is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, you look it up, and they're like, we have no idea why or how this happened, and I don't believe that. I think this may have been a very crucial part to what we're all discussing. I don't understand, but the closest I was able to find was that people had used Roget's thesaurus, and they were able to look and compare how the roots of words, for instance, in the Bible it says Abaddon, the pit of Abaddon, and then you have abdomen, you have abandon, you have all of these words that sound and have the similar roots as potentially spirits or bad, evil spirits. And so I'm wondering if this vowel shift may have altered things such that they were in alignment with the negative roots. Just a guess. That's my guess.
I would say that that's on target as far as this change in language that happened, not just with English, but other modern languages all around the same time. So let's say, for all intents and purposes, 1400 to 1600, our modern languages came into existence. And then when you look at English as the closest thing to a universal language that we have, and they had other languages that they were trying to develop to become this universal language. And I can't think of the name of the one that I'm familiar with, but English is that. English is what we have for a universal language, for the most part. And English has got its own issues with the meanings of words, like you're saying. And I think there's a lot of hidden spelling words within our language, a lot. And I think that's why. And that all came out the same time that we're talking about. And then when you look at Shakespeare and the King James Version of the Bible, a lot of words, English words, came into existence through those two vehicles.
Yeah, and that the Paradise Lost, King James with the Bible, but then before he wrote the Bible, he wrote a book on demonology, and only the king was able to not be. Everybody else was at risk, but the king was completely unable to be affected by demons. And so I'm thinking probably it is the way that they introduce this to the population. This is the means by which they rewrote the history was through these classics.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. The exact classics we're talking about, and other classics as well that aren't quite so well known. And then there's just this incredible obsession with demons in our modern history, from King James to John Dee and Edward Kelly, and all the things that came up from that. And it's all in our narrative starting around this late 1500s, early 1600s time period. And I think that was the real rollout of this New World Order timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the official kickoff of the New World Order timeline was the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851 in London. And so it seems like they were developing the things they needed to move forward in this time period in our history. And in the 1800s, especially in Queen Victoria's reign, a lot of these things were just unfolding and moving forward. And I think they would have gotten away with it, but they gave us the internet, so thank goodness that happened.
Yeah,
Because they got into everything.
Absolutely
everything.
I think just looking lately around the time of the Civil War, and then just hearing like people talking about like the different politicians at that time and their beliefs on constitutionalism and whatnot, I'm really starting to believe that that same time period that you just brought up, and then the American Civil War, we are taught in schooling that it's been continuous since the time of Washington with the second Constitution to today. But I think around that time, during the Crystal Palace and the Civil War in the mid 1800s, what happened was that there actually was a reset of some kind. And that's what your research has really showed with all of the architecture and stuff like that. Something went on at that time period. And I think it's not continuous like we think it is.
Right. I would agree with that. And I think something happened during the time period that we're told the Civil War took place, but I don't think it was what we're told. Mm-hmm. I think something completely different was going on. Whether it was hunting down survivors of the original civilization, it was giving cover for the building of forts that would actually have been star forts and part of the original energy grid, or the destruction of forts. It's not what we've been told, and nothing's what we've been told. So it's just something to keep in mind. They needed to provide an explanation for everything. They educated us in it thoroughly in our, going to school and in movies and in books and our popular culture and in museums. It just reinforces this story, this set of lies that was agreed upon.
Yeah, mythology is that's kind of the distinction that what I was saying is the real history, like what actually objectively happened, and then it's like this American mythology, and it's like this is like our core and values, but it's still a story. And I think that's when the swap happened, was then.
Right. And again, it bears saying that the kinds of things we're talking about, it's like people have to be ready for it. Yeah. Because it's just too much to grasp if you're trying to talk to people that you know and love, your friends, your family, and share this kind of information. It's like I don't even do that because my family's not ready for it. It would not go over very well at all.
Yeah.
But it seems like there are people, especially on the internet that can are ready for it, and those tend to be the ones that find my work or the work of other YouTube researchers doing the same kind of thing, looking at the same issues. It's like you're ready for it, and until then, it's not something that people will easily accept or understand.
Yeah.
And hopefully we're reaching a critical mass in our population, and more people are open to it. But at least as far as I know right now, we're not quite there yet. I'm waiting impatiently to be able to talk to my family about it, but we're not there. I have a couple of cousins that are more open to it.
It's almost this receptiveness to standing on shaky ground. It's like being okay with admitting that you don't necessarily have the full story that you thought, because people are only receptive to it if they're willing to, look at information, are willing to be unsure of things. It's that, willing to admit that you don't know everything.
Right. Which is not easy.
Yeah.
It's not easy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've found is you have to let go of everything you believe to be true in order to receive new information.
Absolutely.
And so that's kind of the first step. And some people will be ready for it, and others won't be. And I think that's just the reality of it. Mm-hmm. But I'll go back to my presentation and keep on moving forward. So we got synthetic dyes in the mid 1800s with all that good stuff in there. And I'm going to return to the subject of cloth as a silent player in the unfolding of what's taken place here. And I believe in the occulting of the New World Order timeline. I do believe we live on an occulted timeline. OCCULTED. Like the previously seen Mercers, who were cloth merchants, haberdashers as well are connected to the clothing business. In Britain, haberdashers sell small items for sewing, dressmaking, and knitting, and in the United States they sell men's clothing, including suits, shirts, and ties. We are told the Haberdashers' Company received its first royal charter in 1448. Milliners, also known as hatters, make hats. They are included in the Worshipful Company of Felt Makers. The felt makers, or makers of felt hats, were incorporated by letters patent granted by King James in 1604. Felt is a textile made by matting, condensing, and pressing fibers together, whether natural fibers or synthetic fibers, and as mentioned, mercury was used in the making of felt hats in the 19th century, causing a high rate of mercury poisoning in those workers. This also leads into the human slavery-based economic system of the fields and the mills set up by the colonizers, both in terms of physical bondage, workhouses, and wage slavery. Let's look at what was going on around 1800 that relates to all of this. First, Mayer Amschel Rothschild's son, Nathan Mayer Rothschild, settled in Manchester, England in 1798 and established a business in textile trading and finance, and made a fortune in a banking enterprise he began in London in 1805 that dealt in foreign bills and government securities. A Freemason since 1802 in the Premier Grand Lodge of England in October of 1802, by the time of his death in 1836, Nathan Mayer Rothschild had secured the position of the Rothschilds as the preeminent investment bankers in Britain and Europe, and his own personal net worth was over 60% of the British national income. Mayer Amschel Rothschild started the Rothschild international banking family dynasty through his 5 sons in Frankfurt, Germany in the 1760s, who were each placed in major cities throughout Europe. Besides Nathan in London, son James was in Paris, son Amschel succeeded his father in Frankfurt, son Karl was in Naples, and son Solomon in Vienna. In America, Alexander Brown was an Irish linen merchant who immigrated to America and established the first investment banking firm in the United States in 1800, just 5 years before Nathan established the Rothschild Bank in London. He was joined in business by his sons William, George, John, and James, and the firm became Alex Brown and Sons in 1810. So his son William established the Liverpool office in England of the family business. George and John founded Brown Brothers and Company in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and James opened a branch in New York City and Boston. This is what we are told about Brown Brothers and Company, that during the first 100 years of its existence, it helped make paper money standard currency in the United States, underwrote the first railroad and transatlantic steamship companies, and essentially created the first foreign exchange system between the American dollar and the British pound. In 1931, Brown Brothers merged with the Harriman Brothers and Company, which was a private bank started with railway money, and it became known as Brown Brothers Harriman and Company in 1931, and one of the largest and oldest private investment banks in the United States. Founding partners of the Brown Brothers Harriman and Company included W. Averill Harriman, the son of railroad baron E. H. Harriman, and Secretary of Commerce under President Harry S. Truman, and Prescott Bush, American banker and politician, and the father of President George H. W. Bush. Another Harriman, E. Roland Harriman, was the chairman of the board of governors of the American Red Cross from 1950 to 1973, and he was the brother of W. Averill Harriman, one of the founding partners of the company. E. Roland Harriman, or Bunny as he was nicknamed, attended Yale University, where he was a member of the Skull and Bones Society with his friend and classmate Prescott Bush. Yale University was named for Elihu Yale, a British merchant and trader who became president of the Madras Presidency in 1684 at the British East India Company settlement at Port St. George in Madras in India. Elihu Yale later became a benefactor of the collegiate school in the colony of Connecticut, which in 1718 was renamed Yale College in his honor. The Skull and Bones Society was founded as an undergraduate senior secret student society at Yale in 1832.
The Brown Brothers Harriman is a very big name in World War II because they had helped Hitler get all the money that he needed. They were ardent supporters of Nazism, fascism. There was actually a little bit of that going on in America, and that was kind of a part of our history that we don't ever want to talk about. But the business plot with Smedley Butler was interesting, trying to recruit basically World War One. They had promised all of the people who went to war bonuses. You know, if you go and you fight, we'll give you a little bit of money, and they never gave it to them. And so they go to Washington and they say, "Hey, we want our money." They called it the bonus army. And Smedley Butler was really highly respected. They send in the National Guard and put that down so they don't pay them. And so Butler is approached by all of these Wall Street people. We could imagine probably Brown Brothers, Harriman, amongst others, to lead a group of these people, these veterans who are now really upset because they burned all their stuff and didn't give them their bonuses. And so it's this idea of possibly having a coup against the American government. And this went down. They call it the business plot. And they don't teach this in school. Nobody knows this happened. There's actually a video of Smedley Butler saying this. So that Wall Street was actively doing business with both sides of World War One and Two, made a lot of money, and a lot of the wealth today. The reason that the numbers are so high is just because of that. World War One and Two went crazy.
Right. You know, and it was not hard to find this information. This is the kind of stuff that you can find.
Mm-hmm.
When you do research of alternative history, it's not always easy to find what you're looking for.
Yeah.
But it's well documented. They don't hide it. They don't teach it to you either, like you're saying.
Mm.
And
The
you start looking at the personalities and the people, the businesses that we all know about. And I mean, I remember hearing about the Rothschilds when I was in high school
really.
in history.
Mm.
You hear the names, but this whole idea of this conspiracy behind it, behind what's taken place here, and how they were all interconnected, all of these threads of history tying together to enslave us, essentially. I'm going to get into that here in just a minute.
Yeah, it's true. I think in my research, what I've found the most, or the organization that covers their tracks the best, by far, is the Catholic Church. That is the information that you have to search very hard for, and that they cover it up very well. But that's there, and it's just stuff that's hidden behind all of the rest. So um, there's so many different players, but what you really start to learn is that they are intermarried. They're almost a lot of times they're related in some way. Smaller group than we're made to think it is.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, the side that's been perpetrating this vast deception on humanity, they walk in lockstep, probably because they're related or they have all these connections or these blood oaths that they've taken, or I'm going to kill you if you spill the beans or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, so they've kept it well covered up until recently. And those who want to know are able to find it out, but they still have this have had this cover, I think, primarily through the media.
Yeah, and people, I think honestly, we don't, like, a lot of people don't have the ability to understand it as well as like we might, you know.
Right. And I only, I was guided into doing this work, and I only know because my research has taken me down a lot of different rabbit holes
Hmm.
and starting to see patterns. So I have a good pattern recognition ability, which has
Yeah.
allowed me to find a lot of information, um, and intuition, and following the threads, so to speak, to where they lead. So finding this connection between cloth and early money, like the Rothschilds and the Browns, being textile and linen merchants, and the Mercers' involvement in the Plymouth colony, and just a lot of different research lines that have taken me to these conclusions.
Yeah.
Um, but it does tie into what's going on now. So I'm going to go ahead, and I'm getting closer to the end, and make some. I'm going to go ahead and finish it through, and then we'll talk some more.
Okay.
Let's see how many slides. Yeah, let me go ahead and go through this, and then we can talk some more. Another noteworthy American financier who emerged between 1800 and 1840 was George Peabody. During the years George Peabody lived in Baltimore, he established his own career as a businessman and financier. He first traveled to England in 1827 to purchase wares and negotiate the sale of American cotton in Lancashire. By 1825, cotton was Britain's biggest import, primarily from American cotton fields, and Lancashire was a dominant force in the British economy with its cotton industry, where the raw cotton was turned into thread and fabrics in a factory-based production line, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution in this industry, and marked the birth of the British working class. George Peabody opened an office in Liverpool, with British business playing a more and more important role in his business affairs. The bankers who helped establish him in Liverpool included Sir William Brown, first Baronet of Richmond Hill, one of the sons of Alexander Brown, who managed his father's Liverpool office. Peabody took up residence in London permanently in 1837, and went from being a wholesale dry goods and cotton merchant to a merchant banker, offering securities in American railroad and canal enterprises to British and European investors. It is significant to note that unless certified by the Global Organic Textile Standard, or GOTS, cotton fabrics are known to contain chemicals like ammonia, heavy metal-based dyes, formaldehyde, flame retardants, petroleum scours, and softeners. This was a new slavery-based system in all of its forms, and it was brought in to benefit the very few at the expense of everyone and everything else. Dun and Bradstreet started out as a mercantile agency in New York City on July 20th of 1841. It was formed by Lewis Tappan, who started out in the dry goods business as well, with his father, and the silk business with his brother, as the first commercial credit rating agency for businessmen seeking credit, and provided a network of correspondents to provide reliable credit information to its subscribers. By 1844, the mercantile agency had over 240 clients and continued to expand, opening offices in Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Benjamin Douglas took over the business in 1849, and he transferred it to Robert Graham Dunn in 1859, who changed the name to R.G. Dunn and Company, and he continued to expand the business across international boundaries and kept it growing from there. Dun & Bradstreet is an American company that provides commercial data, analytics, and insights for businesses, including credit ratings. The company's house came into existence in Great Britain on September 5th of 1844, the same year that the mercantile agency continued to expand into other major cities. The company's house is an executive agency of the British government that maintains a register of companies and is responsible for incorporating all forms of companies in the United Kingdom. Prior to the formation of the company's house, no central company register existed in Great Britain, and companies could only be incorporated through letters patent. The company's house was created by the Joint Stock Companies Act of 1844, which created the Registrar of Joint Stock Companies, enabling companies to be incorporated through registration for England, Wales, and Ireland, but not Scotland. Scotland was added in the Joint Stock Companies Act of 1856. The City of London Corporation is the governing body of the City of London, which is home to most of United Kingdom's financial sector, and is nicknamed the Square Mile. While there is no surviving record of a first charter establishing the corporation as a legal body, it is said to be regarded as incorporation by prescription, or that the law presumed it to be incorporated, since it had been regarded as such for so long. The history of the City of London's corporation, first recorded royal charter, was said to date back to the time of William the Conqueror in 1067 AD. The coat of arms of the City of London Corporation was said to have been in use since 1381 and is anciently recorded at the College of Arms. The dragon supporters on each side of it and the crest on top were said to have been added in the early 17th century. But the basic similarity with the red crosses on a white background between these three coats of arms is unmistakable. The sister cities of the City of London are Washington, D.C. and the Vatican. All three are not considered any part of the country they are located in. In 1871, the 41st Congress handed the duties of governing to the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia was also established as a corporation and the seat of the federal government. Versions of the Constitution after this took place were created by the corporate government. Corporate law is maritime or admiralty law. International maritime admiralty law is the law of the sea or water and money, and is differentiated from the law of the land and natural law, the law of people occupying the land. Admiralty law is the law that governs navigation and shipping. Among other things in our world, the application of international maritime law is how humanity became owned property, or in other words, enslaved, to which our birth certificates are key. When a ship comes into dock in a port, its arrival is called a berth. It is subject to the law of the sea and is governed by the Uniform Commercial Code. When it berths, the captain of the ship must provide a certificate of manifest to the port authorities, documenting everything the ship is carrying, including identity and value. When people are born, they are birthed out of their mother's water and are issued a birth certificate. This is our certificate of manifest, as people are considered to be a corporation-owned item and subject to international maritime admiralty law. Jordan Maxwell is an excellent resource for more information about this subject, and his videos can be found on YouTube. Corporations can only do business with other corporations and can't touch real people. So while the new legal system was busy turning corporations into people and granting them coats of arms, it was turning people into corporations by making them a legal fiction, known as our straw man, which is denoted by our names being spelled out in all capital letters on our birth certificates and other legal documents. This is known as capitis diminutio maxima in Roman law, and signifies the most comprehensive loss of status that occurs when a person's condition was changed from freedom to bondage. It swept away all rights of citizenship and family rights. And that's actually the end of my PowerPoint presentation. And most people would be familiar with that, the last few slides that I shared.
Yeah, I found a while back one of the most comprehensive proofs of the whole straw man thing. It's like written as a legal proof, and it's really advanced. It's all the subtlety in words. The guy who brought the concept out onto the world stage, he had a system known as quantum grammar, which was his attempt to take language, which adjectives allow me to kind of put my subjectivity into language. I could describe something differently than you could. But his idea, David Wynn Miller, his idea was to take language and try to put it into a construct where it was verifiable at any time in the future, or the past, present, future. It was always the same, and so the words would not have a different meaning in the future. They would always mean the same thing. And his idea was to eventually have the language unable to bond people in words and contract. And it's a really interesting way of looking at things, and it makes me wonder if they haven't implemented that system into the giant software machine or AI that they're building. It's interesting. The sentence has different numbers. So, for instance, like a preposition would have a certain number, and it's kind of set up as a verifiable code, and so it has to be the same numerical value forwards and backwards. And if that is the case, then the sentence is in the proper structure and is able to keep that structure forever. It's an interesting concept, but all of this has been done with spell binding and words. That's it. It's all words. It's because
Right.
if I can have a notary notarize a contract, and I hand you a piece of paper and you sign it and it's notarized, it's binding. That's it. I've heard of some pretty extreme cases to that too, but if you have it notarized, then that piece of paper has become a magical chain.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I present that as this is how we got here. Do I think we're going to stay here? No, I don't. But that was what we've been living under, with the few people knowing about the whole strawman UCC thing. Most people not
Mm-hmm.
having any idea that the capital letters on your insurance card or your driver's license or your birth certificate had any meaning, and, legally.
Yeah, it's it's a very advanced system, and I've been told that that's the one kind of like what is it that if you start looking too hard, bad things might happen. And I've been told by really like people I trust, like it's banking, contracts, and stuff like that. It's because the reason that is able to go unnoticed is similar but not actually the same. A lot of people just don't think knowing history is important. That's one thing. But the whole other side is that people really do not understand how powerful words can be. Like, they don't actually understand the power behind words. And those are similar, but there's a little bit of a distinction. And so, if enough people start understanding how they have been enslaved and how this matrix has been built by words, more than anything else, by words, that is where the real danger lies. And that's why recently I've been paying a lot of attention to words, and I think you can find a lot of truth, or at the very least, you can find a little bit of record. Like, as we brought up the vowel shift, something happened there, and that's kind of how I read it. Something happened there if they've changed words and they don't know what happened, just don't know what happened. Everybody started talking different. We don't know why, though.
Yeah. I tend to think a new system was brought in at that time.
I do too.
That was imposed on top of everything else. They were creating a new system, like everything we've been talking about, and the new legal system, and depriving us of our rights and tricking us the whole way through as they're doing it.
Yeah.
And now we're living in a time of the Great Awakening, and I believe that.
I do too.
I believe they never had a chance, but they did everything they could to win, and to rig the whole system in their favor. But I don't think they're going to. I don't think that's. They're not going to ultimately be successful, but they got a long way into it, and we're watching that play out and hopefully fall apart now.
Yeah, Elon Musk even said on an interview, he was like, something to the effect of, the only way to, if you're in a game and there's no way for you to win, then you have to change the rules of the game. He said something to that effect, and basically, yeah, that's what they've done. The education, I'm sitting here thinking, people learning to read, and that's, for most of human history, people didn't really, the average person didn't know how, and so would have been, royals and elite, and that would have been Jesuit training,
Right. And of course, and that's the history we've been taught. And I think humanity was at a much higher level of consciousness before this happened, before something happened. Much higher.
Yeah. And perhaps that's where the changes in language or something comes, because it's not like somebody, like, I don't interpret that as somebody could give an order to say everybody needs to talk differently. That's kind of seemingly a little bit bigger, maybe. I don't know how people were educated, but depending on how long it took for that change to really show up, I wonder if there's like some fake time put in there. This idea of the phantom time, I can't rule that out either.
Yeah, I agree. I can't either. I mean, I think that's likely that has taken place. And I've been saying lately, and this is how it feels to me. It's like we've got this big bag of puzzle pieces, but we don't know what the picture looks like. And so trying to piece it together. But like I said, you can find the information that I shared today. It's there. You can find it. But then you start peeling back the layers and digging and looking at the interconnections between, like, the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company and the practices of today, and how these people are all buddies and interconnected. So Elihu Yale was part of the British East India Company, founds Yale, and that becomes like a little hangout for the elite class with their Skull and Bone Society, just as one example.
The universities,
they're all connected.
Yeah, they are the, people, it's like everybody's in this conspiracy or this cult. And I've kind of come to understand that the Illuminati is the Ivy League universities, because they claim to have be more intelligent, they're more illuminated. They have brotherhoods, fraternities, and whatnot. And so it's kind of hidden right out in the open, and that's the thread that connects every single, almost pretty much like 90% of all world leaders, powerful people, CEOs, businesses, that they usually all went to an Ivy League university of some kind.
And then the word Illuminati, and initially in the original civilization, they would have been illuminated in a different way. They would have been illuminated, glowing, because they had made a connection with their higher selves.
Yeah.
And so they took that identity as well as a whole bunch of other identities away from the people that actually created this beautiful civilization that we still live and work in.
Yeah.
But we don't know that because they gave us new dates and new builders for all the infrastructure. But when you start looking at that and peeling that layer back, it falls apart. And they were building things during the Great Depression and World War I and World War II and the Civil War. And, their stories just don't add up. Or building colossal buildings in a really short period of time, like maybe a year or 2 years, to build these massive buildings. So the stories they overlaid on top of the actual infrastructure, yeah, they explained everything. And they got away with it until people could start doing their own research and comparing notes. And that's where we are. We're doing that and, talking together and going, hey, could you say they built that? Like the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. was built during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Just a massive building.
It's crazy. And it's just 1 year, 2 years.
Yeah, well, it's like 2 years. I want to say it's 2 years, something like that.
Yeah, and then you're right. It's either during the Civil War or during the Great Depression. I I give the benefit of the doubt. Maybe some of them are, whatever, but some of them are just really obvious, and the architects just maybe they studied. We don't really know. They were 26. They're my age. So it's like, okay.
Yeah. And I don't even give them the benefit of the doubt at this point. They're lying.
It's hard, yeah. This idea of the company, it's interesting. It just came to me in this light, but the company, a company of soldiers, one, kind of militarization, but then the body, corporate incorporation. So, the first, if you were to try to form a group of people dedicated to doing something, you would form a corporation or you would form a company. And with the cloth merchants, let's just say the guilds in the city of London, all of them collectively, they had amassed all this wealth. And so I'm guessing that was your drive. The whole driving force was the guilds, and more than just going and selling, but using their, like, look at what's going on with Epstein today. We're finding out that all of these companies that are embedded in society are just kind of outlets or branches for illegal activities, and it's the same then.
It's all the same. It's all the same. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm saying. The origins of it are with these companies.
And missions.
Same company with the Red Cross.
Yeah. Missions.
And so, like with the Rothschilds and the Browns and Peabody and all these people that were amassing this wealth from this new cloth industry, mm-hmm. were financing the recovery of the railroads. And I say recovery because I believe they were infrastructure that was pre-existing infrastructure. So they had to get the railroads up and running to get all this other stuff up and running. Mm-hmm. Their commerce, their factories, all the other things they needed to get going to get this new world functioning.
Yeah.
And then they employed the people in these jobs at not even subsistence wage, and made even more money because they controlled the stores and everything else. So, it was a system that was always designed to benefit, I'm going to say the 1%, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
Elite families, globalists, and disadvantage us. But they always gave us enough to make do and think we were okay, keeping their overall role well hidden. And, taking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's so much to it, and I tend to agree with you that recently, especially with what's gone on in the last couple months, um, I think a lot of people now have a lot of reason to start to dig into these things, to look into them more, and just you know when you build on, if you were to build a house on sand, don't be surprised one day when it starts to fall down. And that's, you look around and things are just so weird, and things like don't really seem natural or human almost. And so I think that's why, is because people are seeing the paint chipping off the wall, and it's almost hard not to be. And maybe it's just me, but I really have a hard time understanding. I feel like people have to create more lies to justify everything's just fine.
Yeah. And
Because
that's exactly what's happening.
yeah,
We see that in real time. They have to lie even harder,
yeah,
and it's not working anymore. There may be some people that are just hopelessly programmed and don't see it, but most people are able to see it when the lies start to become pretty obvious.
yeah.
And so we're there. That's where we are right now. And I think that's ultimately why they won't be successful, because they can't fool everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here I'm going to go ahead and play the little clip of your channel so that everybody can see your work real quick, because I was going to do it at the beginning, but I didn't do it. So here is Michelle's channel. Please go ahead and give her a subscribe, and I will put some of her latest videos in the description and stuff like that. This was a screen clip I took last time, so she's probably got more videos now, but she's got a lot of content. She's been doing this for a very long time. And I was telling her earlier, some of the stuff is actually really nice to rewatch. I feel like I take a lot more from it if I watch it a second time. But it'll take probably a lifetime for somebody to get through all of the videos. But if you haven't, I know that a lot of people who are watching right now might have already come from Michelle's channel. But if you haven't, like and subscribe here, and then go over and like and subscribe Michelle's channel. She will be very grateful for that, and I will as well, for her coming and doing this episode, a second episode, along with the presentation and slideshow. I appreciate that. That was very nice to do. Um, is there anything else? Any last thoughts, or any last notes, or anything you want
The only thing that I would say is that I encourage people to start with your own communities and start looking at things differently, because it doesn't take much to have the veil of illusion fall if you look at things from a different perspective and start asking questions.
Yeah.
And just want to thank you, Josh, for your work as Urban Odyssey and all the things that you're doing to help get this information out there. I know have your hands in a lot of pies and looking at things differently, and getting it out there. So I'm kind of focused on one area, and you're like, you're looking at all different kinds of areas.
Your mind goes fast. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it is. You find one thing, and then a question pops up, and then you have to go to answer that question, and it's another, they call it rabbit holes or whatever.
Exactly.
Been doing that for a long time.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. The deeper you look, the more you find, and the more work you have to do. It's never ending.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, alrighty. I think that about wraps it up for today. Again, guys, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and then give Michelle a like and a follow. And perhaps we will do another one in the near future. We will talk about that afterwards. But guys, thank you for tuning in. Michelle, thank you for being here and for the presentation.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me.
All right. Take care, everybody. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.